watershed is an important resource because of the natural, cultural, and recreational resources that it provides. The natural resources include some of the best spawning habitat for anadromous fish. The cultural resources include our history. Our forefathers fought to preserve this land, and before them, the Native American Indians actually used the watershed to sustain themselves, to basically survive. From a recreational standpoint, this is what we do, this is how we enjoy ourselves, so it's important to have a clean, viable watershed for boating, fishing, and swimming. A watershed is an area of land that has one thing in common. Now, the thing in common is that all the water in that area, all the water that gets to that area flows to one central point, or one general area, or an end point, which is usually a river. In this case, it's the Fore River. So if you're within the watershed and you live in Braintree, or you're within the watershed and you live in Holbrook, the water on a rainy day that hits your driveway eventually flows to the Fore River, believe it or not. Whether it flows through the ground, through a tributary to the river, or through some type of a creek, it all ends up into the river, which flows out from the Fore River into Hingham Bay.
Well, as far as we know, the earliest native peoples in continental North America right now are located in the east, roughly 26,000 years ago, at a place called Meadowcroft. At the same time, we know that the glaciers themselves that last retreated from this area 13,000 years ago exposed a huge amount of land, almost 250 million square miles of more New England sticking out into the water. So we know, bit by bit, native people were coming here by boat along that coastline. So the Weymouth Fore River would have been a very inviting place for the earliest people, red paint people and others, to settle and have encampments. And we have archaeological evidence that will show that.
The people were the Massachusetts people. This is where the state got its name, Massachusetts, but it came from the Massachusetts. The watershed obviously wasn't called the watershed by native people, but water was very important to native people everywhere. But here in Massachusetts, it was the source of food, and it was the highway. The natural resources of the watershed and how the people used them was very important, primarily because this was a source of food, and the river was the highway. The highway of early American people were the river, the streams. This is how we got from place to place. The resources, which were the natural resources, the fish, were important for, obviously, for food, and very little for any other reason, because these fish were very small. So they were eaten and salted and kept for the winter. They hunted in the way of all Aboriginal people. They used primitive, what we would now call primitive hunting tools, which was a bow and arrow, a spear, or a spear with an attle, which was a throwing stick. That's how they brought down larger game. They could have also brought larger game down with herding them into a place where they could be slaughtered once they got into a corral or a closed-end place. They fished with fish hooks, believe it or not, and the fish hooks were made by bone, and that's how individual fishermen would fish for a fish, a large fish, a sturgeon, or a salmon. They also used nets, and certainly the most prevalent way of fishing was to use a weir, W-E-I-R, which was a form of directing fish into a place where they could not escape. What happened to the Massachusetts people? The Massachusetts people, once they were part of the contact period and the Christians came to this land, the Massachusetts and others were forced to accept Christianity. And that was a survival tactic for them. If they did not and could not conceive of giving up their philosophy of life, those who could not do that left. They left and they went west, or they went north, where the invaders had not yet established a strong foothold.
The Fore River watershed has undergone tremendous changes, really, over the recent centuries, mostly in regards to land use and water use. There's been a fair amount of development close to the river, both in terms of residential development, roadways, as well as retail and commercial complexes. All this development, what it does is it changes the way water flows into the watershed and reduces the amount of cleansing that you get from stormwater. So those changes have not been good for the river. Also, we're probably taking more water out of the river for municipal water supplies as well. The Fore River watershed actually has a fair number of anadromous fish species. It doesn't have the more glamorous species like the shad or Atlantic salmon, but it does have a decent population of rainbow smelt. There are small populations of river herring, both blueback herring and alewives, and there are further down the estuary some white perch and Atlantic tomcod. The Fore River has a fair amount of very good habitat for rainbow smelt. It doesn't have that much great habitat for river herring. If you look out here, you can see these riffles right here are very suitable for smelt spawning. Smelt come up in the springtime to spawn. They drop their eggs in these fast-flowing, turbulent riffles, and the eggs survive and hatch out, and the larvae move right back down to the estuary. So if you look downstream and upstream, you can see very nice riffles for rainbow smelt to spawn in. Years ago, I think anadromous fish were much more important to the region, both in terms of a food species for residents as well as for commerce. You had very large populations of river herring, you had shad, you had rainbow smelt, and there was commercial harvest of all these species. So it was important culturally, it was important in terms of commerce and for recreational use as well. That has diminished greatly as all these populations have declined very much so in recent years. In terms of freshwater species in the Fore River watershed, you have a decent number of freshwater species. There's freshwater bass, there's chain pickerel, there's golden shiners, you have some sunfish species, and some forage species that are important to the food chain in the Fore River.
The species of wildlife that live in this watershed include white-tailed deer, red fox, striped skunk, gray squirrels, and birds like wild turkeys, the great bull herring, certain gulls, Canadian geese, ducks, and other reptiles like bullfrogs and turtles and the like. The watershed is important to wildlife that calls the watershed their home because of the whole circle of life, or what the wildlife actually do here. The wildlife need to eat, they need to drink. If they prey on fish, obviously the watershed needs to be able to sustain fish or forage food for them, like the great bull herring needs to have the fish to survive, or they won't live in the watershed. The white-tailed deer needs to feed on the vegetation, also needs to drink from the watershed, so if the water is polluted, or if there isn't water, there'll be no vegetation, so they won't inhabit the watershed. The biodiversity of the watershed is a real good indicator of the health of the watershed. The wildlife community, it's a good indication of the balance. Having a lot of biodiversity indicates that the watershed is in balance, it's healthy, and that it's working. The watershed is currently being used in a mixed fashion. The watershed has a lot of industrial users, but it also has a lot of recreational users as well. Recreational uses include boating, fishing, swimming, water skiing. The rivers are actually used by a lot of different watercraft, canoes, kayaks, and things like that. People should care because everything that you do is going to impact everybody and everything else in the watershed. For example, anything that you discharge, whether it's waste from washing your car, whether it's oil from changing your oil, if you discharge that within the watershed, it will eventually impact everybody and everything in the watershed. Get involved. You need to get involved with your watershed because it's where you live. It impacts everything that you do, and it impacts your life. Volunteerism. Get involved with the watershed or with the groups, the communities that are actually helping out. Whether it's volunteering for the monitoring program, looking out for sources of pollution, whether they're point sources, non-point sources, things that actually impact the watershed. Pick up trash. Make the area around you better.